Daughter-in-law told me my cat was gone. Those were her exact words. Gone, Vera. I'm sorry. She passed in the night. She said it standing in my kitchen doorway, arms crossed, head tilted at that particular angle she always used when she wanted to seem sympathetic, but couldn't quite manage it. My daughter-in-law, Sherry, married to my son Lyle for 11 years. I'm Vera Hutchins. I'm 67 years old. I live alone in the house where I raised my children, and until 3 weeks before that morning, I had shared that house with a 16-year-old tortoiseshell cat named Biscuit. Biscuit was not just my cat. She was my late husband Frank's cat first. He found her behind the auto parts store where he worked, the summer before he got sick. She was maybe 3 weeks old, eyes barely open, screaming in a cardboard box someone had left by the dumpster. Frank had driven home on his lunch break, set her in my lap, and said I couldn't leave her. That was Frank in 6 words. He died 14 months later. Pancreatic cancer. The kind that moves fast and doesn't apologize. Biscuit was the only creature in this world who had known him the way I did, who had slept on his side of the bed every single night since we lost him, who still sometimes sat by his chair in the den and looked at the door like she was expecting him to walk through it. I know how that sounds. I'm 67, not senile. I know she was a cat, but grief makes you hold on to things, and she was what I had left of him. So when Sherry told me Biscuit was gone, I didn't cry. I couldn't. I just stood there holding my coffee cup and staring at the floor, and somewhere underneath the numbness, I felt something pull loose inside my chest that I wasn't sure would ever go back together. Sherry had been staying with me that week. That was the cover story anyway, that she was helping me out after I'd had a minor procedure done on my knee. In reality, I hadn't asked her to come. She'd invited herself. She and Lyle had been through a rough patch the past year, money arguments mostly, and I think being in my house gave her some sense of access she didn't have at home. Access to what? I wasn't sure yet. Biscuit had never liked Sherry. That sounds petty, I know, but it's relevant. From the very first time Sherry came to Sunday dinner, this was years ago when Lyle first brought her home, Biscuit had watched her from across the room with that flat, unblinking stare that cats reserve for people they decided are not to be trusted. Sherry always said she was allergic, but I'd seen her pet other cats just fine. I'd seen her hold my neighbor's Persian for 20 minutes without so much as a sniffle, and Biscuit had spent years noticing things I'd missed. There was the time Biscuit had gotten into Sherry's purse, knocked it off the counter while Sherry was in the bathroom, and when I went to pick up the spilled contents, I'd found a key I didn't recognize. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. I wish I had. After Sherry told me Biscuit was gone, she handed me a small cardboard box, the kind pet cremation services use. She said she'd called someone, that she'd handled it, that she didn't want me to have to deal with the pain of finding her. She said this with her hand on my arm and her eyes soft with performed grief. I thanked her. I don't know why. Shock, maybe. Or the particular paralysis that comes from being ambushed by something so awful you don't even know what you're supposed to do with it. She left 2 days later. Back to Lyle. Back to their house across town. I set the little cardboard box on the mantel next to Frank's photo, and I didn't leave the house for a week. Then, on the 9th day, I heard something outside my back door at 2:20 in the morning. I was already awake. I hadn't been sleeping well. I heard it once, stopped, thought I imagined it, then it came again. A sound I knew. I've heard people say their hearts dropped. That's what mine did. I actually pressed my hand to my sternum because it felt like something physically fell. I went to the back door. Through the glass panel, I could see the yard in the pale gray light from the street lamp 2 houses down, and there, at the edge of the garden bed that Sherry had spent 3 days the previous fall insisting on rearranging for me, the one she'd pulled out and redug and replanted with what she called a Nisser layout, there was Biscuit. My Biscuit, matted and thin and limping on her back left leg, scrabbling at the dark dirt, with the desperate focus of an animal who has decided this is the most important thing she will ever do. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. She didn't run when she heard me. She turned her head, looked at me with those green eyes, and then turned back to the dirt. I knelt on the wet grass in my nightgown, completely unconcerned with my knee, and I just put my hand on her side and felt her breathing. She was breathing. She was breathing. She was warm. She was alive. "Baby," I said, and that was when I started crying, and once I started I couldn't stop for a very long time. I brought her inside. I got water into her first. Then I opened 2 cans of food. She smelled it before she saw it. And I sat on the kitchen floor and watched her eat while the clock on the microwave said 2047 a.m., and I tried to understand what was happening. She was hurt, but not badly. A cut on her back paw, some weight loss scratches along her side. She had clearly been somewhere she wasn't supposed to be and had found her way back out of it. I called my friend Dennis the next morning. Dennis had been a sheriff's deputy for 31 years before he retired, and he'd lived 3 streets over for almost as long as we had. He and Frank used to argue about baseball on the back porch every summer. After Frank died, Dennis had quietly made a habit of checking on me, not in an intrusive way, just a phone call here and there, showing up to fix the gutter that one November when the wind took it down. He was the kind of man Frank would have trusted, which meant I trusted him too. I told him Biscuit was alive. There was a silence on his end, and then he said, "Vera, how is that possible?" I told him I didn't know. I told him Biscuit had been digging in the garden. Another silence. Longer this time. "What did Sherry say when she told you the cat was gone? Did she say where? Did she take her to a vet?" I thought about it. She hadn't. She'd said someone, and handed me a box and stood there with her hand on my arm. "She handled it," I said. "That's all she said." "Vera," Dennis said carefully, "I'd like to come over." He was at my door within the hour. He brought coffee and a look on his face I recognized from the years of knowing him, the look he got when something was wrong, and he was trying to stay calm about it so as not to alarm the person he was talking to. We sat at the kitchen table. Biscuit was on the chair next to mine, cleaned up and wrapped in the old cardigan I'd left on the seat, watching Dennis with the particular attention she gave to people she considered worth watching. He asked me to walk him through the whole week. Sherry arriving, what she'd said she was there for, how Biscuit had been behaving, the garden rearrangement. That stopped him. "When did she do the garden?" he asked. "Last fall. October, I think. She said the original layout wasn't draining properly and she wanted to fix it before winter." I paused. "I didn't ask her to do it. She just started one day. I watched from the window. She was out there for hours." Dennis put his coffee down. "Vera, did Sherry have a key to your house before that visit?" I thought about the key in the purse. I thought about how she'd arrived that week not with a bag packed for an overnight stay, but with boxes. Actual moving boxes, which she'd explained as storing some things while she and Lyle sorted out space in their garage. I'd let her put them in my basement. "I think she might have had one," I said. "I'm not sure when." Dennis asked if he could look at the garden. It was a cold morning, the ground still half frozen from a frost 2 nights before. He walked the length of the raised bed slowly, hands in his jacket pockets, saying nothing. Biscuit had come out with us and was sitting on the top porch step watching him with her tail curled around her feet. He crouched at the section where she'd been digging. He looked at the ground, then looked up at me. "This soil's been disturbed recently," he said. "More than once. He didn't have a warrant. He wasn't on duty. He was just a retired deputy crouching in my garden on a cold morning. And he told me gently that he could not dig this up himself, but that I absolutely had the right to dig up my own garden whenever I wanted, and that if I happened to find something there, I should not touch it and I should call him immediately." I got the hand trowel from the garage. Biscuit walked down the porch steps and sat 3 feet from where I was kneeling in the dirt, watching. It took me less than 8 minutes. The first thing I found was a plastic bag, the heavy-duty kind, sealed with duct tape. I sat back on my heels and looked at it without touching it. Then I found a second one. Then underneath both of them, something that made me stop breathing for a moment. A small metal lockbox, the kind you can get at any hardware store, scratched and dirty, but latched shut. I called Dennis. He was back within 15 minutes, and he made a call of his own, and within the hour there were 2 people from the county sheriff's office standing in my backyard looking at what I'd put carefully on a towel on my porch table. I won't tell you exactly what was in those bags. I'm not going to use words that don't feel right coming out of my mouth. What I'll tell you is that it wasn't garden supplies, and the lockbox held documents, papers with names and numbers and what Dennis, after a quiet conversation with the deputies, described to me as transaction records. Sherry's name was on several of them. So was Lyle's. I went inside and sat down on the kitchen floor, and Biscuit climbed into my lap, and I just held her. This was not the moment I'd expected. I want to be very honest about that. when you've been a mother for 38 years, when you have spent decades loving a person and watching them grow and believing that they are fundamentally good, finding out something like this doesn't feel like a dramatic reveal. It feels like the floor dropping out from underneath the house you've lived in your whole life. It feels like vertigo. It feels like grief, which I already knew something about. Lyle was my son. Whatever he'd done, whatever he'd let Sherry do, he was still the little boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder at church, and who had cried at Frank's funeral in a way that broke something open in me because I'd never seen him cry before. He was also apparently someone who had been using my house. My home, the home his father worked 30 years to pay for, to hide things that could put both of us in serious danger. And Sherry had taken my cat. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not even the legal piece of it, though believe me, that matters. That matters enormously. But she had looked me in the eye and told me my cat was dead. She had handed me a box. She had stood in my kitchen with her hand on my arm and let me grieve something that wasn't even gone. A woman like that, who can do something like that, is not someone I will underestimate again. The deputies told me later that Biscuit had been taken to a shelter 40 minutes away. A legitimate shelter. Sherry had apparently not wanted to risk anything more complicated, and had been checked in under a false name. The theory was that Sherry had noticed Biscuit watching her, had got nervous about leaving the cat in the house while she worked, and had decided to remove the problem. What Sherry hadn't counted on was a 16-year-old cat with Frank's stubbornness, and apparently a better sense of direction than most people give cats credit for. She'd been gone 9 days. 9 days, and she'd found her way back from 40 miles away. I don't know all of what she went through to get here. I don't know how she got out of the shelter, or exactly how long she'd been traveling, or what she'd eaten. I do know that she came straight to that garden, and I do know what she found there. And I do know that if she hadn't come back when she did, none of the rest of it would have happened. Frank always said she was the smartest creature in the house. He wasn't wrong. The investigation took several weeks. I won't walk through all of it because some of it is still not fully resolved. What I can tell you is that the records in that lockbox were significant, that Sherry was not acting alone, and that several people besides her were eventually involved in what came after. Lyle called me 5 days after the deputies came to my yard. I let it go to voicemail. He called again the next day and the one after that. On the 4th day, I answered. He said he was sorry. I said, I know. He started to explain, and I let him talk because he was my son and I still loved him and I didn't know what else to do. He said he hadn't known everything. He said Sherry had handled most of it. He said he'd been scared and hadn't known how to get out. I've thought a lot about whether I believe him. I think parts of it are true. I think he was weak in the way that people sometimes are weak. Not evil, just unwilling to look directly at hard things, unwilling to make costly choices, and that kind of weakness lets other people fill the space. Sherry had filled a great deal of space. Sherry had filled a great deal of space. He didn't ask me about the cat. I didn't tell him she was sitting on the kitchen table next to my coffee cup, watching me with Frank's same patient eyes, waiting for me to finish the call so I could give her her morning medication and her breakfast. I haven't spoken to Sherry. I don't intend to. I did go to the mantel and take down the little cardboard box she'd given me. I held it for a moment. Then I opened it. It was full of potting soil. I stood in my living room in front of Frank's photograph, holding a box of dirt that my daughter-in-law had handed me as proof of my cat's death, and I laughed. It came out of me before I could stop it. Not a happy laugh, but the laugh you laugh when something is so audacious, so breathtakingly bold in its cruelty, that your body doesn't know what else to do with it. Frank would have laughed too. Then he would have gotten very quiet, the way he did when something had crossed a line. I set the box down on the coffee table. I went to the kitchen. I fed Biscuit her breakfast and sat with her while she ate. Dennis came by that evening. We sat on the back porch even though it was cold, and he brought a thermos of good coffee and we watched the yard in the late gray November light. Biscuit sat in my lap with her chin on my knee. He didn't say much. Dennis is good at not saying much. After a while he said, "You doing okay, Vera?" I thought about it honestly before I answered. My son had been involved in something that was now a legal matter. My daughter-in-law was likely facing charges. My garden had been used as a hiding place for things I still didn't fully understand, and I was 67 years old and living alone in this house, and the person I most wanted to talk to about all of it had been gone for 9 years. "I think so," I said. "Frank would be proud of you. Dennis said, very quietly, not looking at me. I didn't say anything for a moment. I looked out at the bare garden bed, the soil still loose and dark where the deputies had finished their work. I looked at the porch door where Biscuit had stood in the cold at 2 a.m, summoning me. He would have been angrier than I was, I said finally. He had a shorter fuse. Dennis smiled into his coffee. That's true. But he always said she was the best thing he ever found behind that parts store. We sat there a while longer. The cold came in off the neighbor's field the way it does in late fall. That clean, sharp edge that makes the air smell like iron and frozen leaves. And Biscuit settled further into my lap with a sound that was somewhere between a purr and a sigh. And I pulled my coat a little tighter. And I stayed right there. I'm not going to tell you this story has a clean ending. Because it doesn't. Life doesn't, and I've been around long enough to stop expecting it to. Lyle is working with an attorney. There are still hearings ahead. There are conversations I dread, and some I've already had that were worse than I imagined. There is a particular loneliness in having a family fracture this way, and having to grieve a version of your child that maybe never quite existed the way you thought. But here's what I know. I know that Biscuit walked 40 miles on a bad paw because she was not finished. I know that Frank found her for a reason, even if he didn't know what it was at the time, because that's how grace sometimes works. It shows up before you know you need it, and it waits. I know that I am not the woman I was 2 months ago before any of this. I am less trusting in some ways and more certain in others. I am more careful about who I let into this house. I am less willing to set aside the small, uncomfortable things, the key I didn't recognize, the garden that didn't need rearranging, the allergies that weren't allergies, because I'd rather not make waves. And I know that every morning when I come downstairs, there is a tortoiseshell cat sitting on the kitchen table who has no business being alive and absolutely no awareness of that fact. She just looks at me like, well, are you going to make coffee or not? I do. I make the coffee or not. I do. I give her her breakfast. I sit down at the table where Frank used to sit, and we start another day. I thought a lot about what I would say here, the part where you're supposed to wrap it up neatly and hand the audience something they can take home. I've always been a little suspicious of stories that end too cleanly. Life doesn't do that. Mine certainly hasn't. But I do think there's something worth sitting with, and it's this. The things we dismiss as small usually aren't. I dismissed the key in Sherry's purse. I dismissed the garden that didn't need rearranging. I dismissed the way Biscuit watched her from across the room, year after year, with that flat green stare that said something I wasn't willing to hear. I told myself I was being gracious. I told myself I was keeping the peace, not making things uncomfortable, being the kind of mother-in-law who didn't meddle. What I was actually doing was choosing comfort over honesty. My own comfort. The comfort of not having to confront something difficult. And that choice has a cost that eventually comes due. That's not self-blame. I want to be clear about that. What Sherry did was Sherry's doing, and Lyle's choices were Lyle's choices. But I think there is a kind of wisdom that only gets built through hard experience. And part of that wisdom is learning to trust the small, uncomfortable feelings you've been trained your whole life to smooth over and set aside. Biscuit never set it aside. She watched. She noticed. And when it mattered, she moved. There's something about that I find genuinely instructive. Not because I think a cat has more sense than a person, though on some days the argument is not unreasonable, but because she operated without the social machinery that so often gets in our way. She didn't worry about being impolite. She didn't wonder if she was overreacting. She didn't talk herself out of what she already knew. She just paid attention, and then she acted on what she'd seen. I think that's what courage actually looks like most of the time. Not grand gestures, not confrontations in the rain, just the quiet willingness to look at the thing directly, even when looking at it is going to cost you something. It cost me a great deal to look at what was in that garden. It cost me more to look at what it meant about my son. I'm still paying parts of that cost, and I expect I will be for some time. But I'll tell you what I know from the other side of it. Not looking would have cost me more. Frank used to say that the truth doesn't care whether you're ready for it. I used to think that was a little harsh. I understand it better now. What I want, if you take anything from this, is for you to trust yourself more than you think you should. Trust the thing that pulls at you at 2 a.m. Trust the detail that doesn't quite fit. Trust the creature sitting at the end of your couch who has never once liked the person you keep making excuses for. You're smarter than you've been told. Your instincts are sharper than you've been given credit for. And the truth, when you finally let yourself see it, is survivable. even when it hurts, even when it changes everything, even when you have to sit on a cold kitchen floor and cry before you can figure out what comes next. You get up, you make the coffee, you start another day. That's all any of us can do. But it turns out that's enough.